the first shovel of earth was the hardest. It broke the seal of the frost-hardened ground, a dark, wet wound against the pale grass of late autumn. Elias Thorne, all of 19 years and carrying the weight of a man twice his age, drove the steel spade in with a grunt, his boot heel pressing down until the soil groaned and gave way. Beside him, a great gray dog with intelligent yellow eyes watched the proceedings, its tail giving a single, thoughtful thump against the earth. The dog's name was Boro, and he had been watching Elias like this for 3 months, ever since the quiet ceremony on the hill behind the cabin. Elias was not digging a grave. He was digging a hole for a post, the first of 84. The post, a 10-foot length of peeled pine, lay on the ground, smelling of resin and cold air. It was the first bone in a skeleton that only Elias could see. He worked with a silent, rhythmic efficiency that his father had taught him. Dig, lift, toss. The pile of dark soil grew. The sun was a weak coin in the gray sky, offering little warmth. He could feel the eyes on him from across the valley. From the Croft farm, a curl of smoke rose from the chimney, and Elias knew Jedediah Croft was watching from his porch, cup of coffee in hand, judging. He finished the first hole, 3 feet deep and perfectly round, then moved 10 feet over and began the next. He did not look up. He did not need to. He had heard the whispers in town when he went for supplies. The Thorne boy's losing his mind. Grief does strange things. Buying up all the old window sashes from the abandoned mill. What for? He never answered, just paid his $17, loaded the warped frames and cracked panes onto his father's old cart, and walked the 5 miles back to his isolated plot of land. His father's cabin stood small and defiant against the vast, looming backdrop of the northern woods. It was a sturdy thing, built of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney breathing a steady plume of white smoke into the air. It was the only home Elias had ever known, and now he was preparing to encase it. He was building a house around his house. The idea had come from the journals. After his parents were gone, taken by the fever that swept through the valley in late summer, Elias had spent his nights reading his father's words by candlelight. His father had been a man of quiet observation, a tinkerer, a dreamer who wrote down everything. He had filled a dozen leather-bound books with sketches of birds, weather patterns, and strange contraptions. And in the last journal, there were pages and pages dedicated to a single, radical idea. He called it the sun shell. The drawing showed their small cabin at the center of a larger, transparent structure, a greenhouse, a buffer against the brutal winters that defined life in this part of the country. His father had written about thermal mass, about the way the stone chimney and the dark log walls would absorb the sun's heat during the day, even in winter, and radiate it back through the night. He wrote of the air gap, a 10-foot buffer on all sides between the inner cabin and the outer glass walls, an insulating layer that would blunt the force of the wind and trap precious warmth. He had calculated the angle of the roof for maximum solar gain when the sun was low in the winter sky. It was a beautiful, impossible theory. His father had never had the time or the money to build it. Now, Elias had nothing but time. By the end of the first day, he had dug 6 holes. His hands were raw, the beginnings of blisters forming on his palms. Boro nudged a cold nose into his hand, whining softly. Elias just rubbed the dog's thick ruff. "It has to be done," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It was the first thing he'd said all day. The next morning, as he was setting the first posts, tamping the earth around them until they stood perfectly plumb, Jedediah Croft finally made his way over. He was a tall, weathered man with a face like a topographical map, his experience etched into every line. He leaned against the split-rail fence that marked Elias's property, chewing on a piece of straw. "Morning, son," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. Elias nodded, not stopping his work. He lifted another heavy post into its hole. "Putting up a new fence?" Jedediah asked, though he knew perfectly well it was no fence. The posts were too tall, too close together. "No," Elias said. Jedediah spat the straw onto the ground. "Look, boy, I knew your father. He was a good man, but he had ideas. Some of them were better left on paper. Whatever this is, it's a waste of good timber. Winter's coming on fast. You should be splitting wood, not digging holes." Elias paused, his hands on the wooden tamper. He looked at Jedediah, his gaze steady. "I have a plan." "A plan?" Jedediah scoffed, a dry, rattling sound. "A plan to build a glass palace in the middle of nowhere? That's what Martha Gable is calling it. She's worried sick about you. Thinks you'll shatter the whole thing with one clumsy swing of an axe and freeze to death in a pile of broken dreams." Elias went back to tamping the earth. The sound was a rhythmic thudding, a punctuation mark at the end of Jedediah's concern. "This land is unforgiving," Jedediah pressed on. "It doesn't reward foolishness. You build what works. 4 solid walls, a tight roof, and a big woodpile. That's how we survive here, not with this." He gestured vaguely at the line of posts. Elias finished his tamping and moved to the next post. He didn't have the words to explain the physics of it, the elegant logic in his father's journals. He couldn't articulate the deep, cellular certainty he felt that this was the right thing to do. The only thing to do, so he said nothing. His actions would have to be his argument. Jedediah watched him for another long, silent minute, then shook his head and turned to leave. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he called back over his shoulder. "When that first blizzard hits, you'll regret every second you spent on this folly." Elias watched him go, then looked down at Boro, who had been sitting patiently, his gaze flicking between the two men. The dog let out a low sigh, as if to say the conversation had been tiresome. Elias knelt and scratched behind the dog's ears. "He means well," Elias whispered. Boro licked his chin in agreement. Then Elias picked up his shovel and started on the 7th hole. The work was his answer. The work was his faith. It was all he had left. He had 84 posts to set, a frame to build, and 312 salvaged window panes to install. Winter was indeed coming. He knew it better than anyone. It was the reason he was digging. It was the reason he had to finish. Weeks bled into one another, measured not by the calendar, but by the progress of the structure. The 84 posts went in, a strange timber circle around the small cabin. Then came the beams, heavy logs Elias had felled himself last spring with his father. He'd spent the summer peeling and seasoning them, never imagining this was what they were for. Now, using a system of ropes and levers his father had designed in one of his journals, he hoisted them into place, one by one. It was slow, back-breaking work. His muscles screamed in protest each morning, and his hands, once merely calloused, were now a permanent landscape of cuts, scrapes, and deep, hardened ridges of skin. He ate standing up, slept the dreamless sleep of the exhausted, and rose before the sun to begin again. Boro was his constant shadow. The dog would lie in a patch of weak sunlight, head on his paws, watching Elias wrestle with a stubborn beam, or carefully measure a cross brace. When Elias finally stumbled down from the scaffolding at dusk, Boro would be there, pressing his solid warmth against Elias's leg, a silent offering of support. The frame rose slowly, a wooden cage taking shape around the cabin. People from the town started making excuses to ride by, slowing their horses and wagons to stare. Silas Sterling, the man who owned the lumber mill and half the valley besides, stopped his gleaming black buggy one afternoon. He was a man built of soft edges and hard currency, his face perpetually flushed with indignation at the inefficiencies of the world. "Thorne!" he barked, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. Elias, perched 20 feet up on a crossbeam, looked down. "What in God's name is the meaning of this monstrosity?" Sterling demanded, gesturing with a gloved hand. "It's an eyesore. And what's this I hear about you taking all the old sashes from the abandoned mill? That's my property." "I paid the foreman," Elias said, his voice even. $17, Sterling sputtered. $17? The glass alone is worth more than that in scrap. You're building a shack out of my windows?" "No," Elias said. "I'm building a shell." "A shell?" Sterling laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You're a fool, boy, just like your father, full of nonsensical ideas that don't put food on the table. Wait until the first hailstorm, or the first heavy snow. The weight will bring this whole flimsy thing crashing down on your head. A waste of good glass. A complete waste." He snapped the reins, and the buggy lurched away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and derision. Elias watched him go. He looked at the cabin, his home, nestled safely inside the growing frame. Then he looked at his hands, gripping the rough wood of the beam. A waste. The word echoed in the crisp air. He picked up his hammer and drove another nail home. The sharp, percussive sound was a defiant reply. Lena Croft came by a few days later. She didn't stop at the fence like her father. She walked right up to the base of the structure, her hands in the pockets of her woolen coat, her expression one of genuine curiosity, not judgment. Boro, who barked at strangers, greeted her with a friendly wag of his tail. "Hello, Elias," she said, her voice clear and calm. He climbed down from the scaffolding, wiping sawdust from his brow with the back of his hand. He was not used to visitors who came this close. "Lena." She tilted her head back, her eyes tracing the lines of the rafters against the pale blue sky. "My father says you're building a monument to foolishness." Elias shrugged, picking up a piece of scrap wood and examining its grain. "Mr. Sterling says you're going to be buried under a pile of snow and broken glass," she continued, her tone neutral, merely reporting the news. He remained silent. "I don't think so," she said quietly. He looked up, surprised. She was looking at him, not the structure. "I was reading one of my mother's old botany books. It talked about cold frames, how they use the sun to keep plants from freezing even when there's snow on the ground. Is that what this is? A giant cold frame?" Elias felt a strange loosening in his chest. To be understood, even partially, was a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. He found his voice. "Something like that, a buffer. It traps the heat." "The air," she said, her eyes lighting up with understanding. "The layer of air between the glass and the cabin walls. That's the real insulation." He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "My father drew it." "I'd like to see the drawings sometime," she said. It wasn't a polite suggestion. It was a simple statement of fact. Before he could respond, she pointed to a stack of lumber near the cabin door. "That's your wood pile for the winter." It was a modest stack, perhaps 2 cords. Jedediah Croft's woodpile, visible across the valley, was a mountain, at least 10 cords high, a testament to a lifetime of preparing for the worst. "It's not nearly enough," she said, a hint of her father's practical concern in her voice. "It's not my woodpile," Elias said. He led her around the side of the cabin, into the 10-foot gap between the log wall and the line of posts that marked where the glass would be. There, sheltered from the sky, was his real preparation. Stacked neatly from the ground to the eaves of the cabin, running the entire 40-foot length of the north wall, was a massive, perfectly organized wall of split oak and maple. At least 15 cords. It was a fortress of firewood. Lena stared at it, her mouth slightly open. "It's dry," she whispered. "It will stay dry," Elias said. "All winter." She understood then. It wasn't just about warmth from the sun. It was about preservation. Every other man in the valley stored his wood outside, covering it with oilcloth or hides, but the damp always crept in. The snows would inevitably bury the bottom half of the pile, leaving it a frozen, useless block until the spring thaw. Firewood, the very currency of survival, was always a battle against moisture. Elias was planning to sidestep the battle entirely. "Elias," she said, her voice full of a new respect. "This is clever." He just nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. He turned and picked up his hammer. He had work to do. But as he climbed back up the ladder, he felt her gaze on him, and for the first time, the solitude of his labor felt less like a burden and more like a purpose. The first snowflakes fell the day he began installing the glass. They were fat, wet flakes that melted the moment they touched the ground, a gentle warning from the sky. The work became painstaking. Each of the 312 panes was a different size, salvaged from the old mill. He had to measure each opening in the frame, find a pane that fit or cut one down, and then carefully set it in place with glazing points and putty he made himself from linseed oil and chalk. It was delicate, nerve-wracking work. A single slip could destroy a pane he couldn't replace. His hands, accustomed to the brute force of logs and hammers, had to learn a new language of gentleness. He worked with a focused intensity, his breath fogging in the cold air. Bora would often sit directly beneath him, watching the slivers of glass fall like sharp, glittering rain. Mrs. Gable, a kind woman whose worry was as vast and smothering as a snowdrift, brought him a meat pie one afternoon. She stood at the edge of the construction, clutching her shawl, her face etched with anxiety. "Elias, child, you're all skin and bones," she said, holding out the pie. "You can't keep this up. It's almost December. A proper house needs to be sealed and chinked by now, not open to the elements." "It will be sealed," he said, accepting the pie. The warmth of it seeped into his cold fingers. "With glass?" she cried, her voice rising. "Child, that's no barrier at all. The wind will howl right through it. You'll catch your death in this glass box. Please, come stay with us until you see sense. My husband can help you board this thing up properly." "Thank you for the pie, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll be fine. This is my home." She left shaking her head, convinced she was talking to a ghost already. The encounter settled a cold knot of doubt in his stomach. What if they were right? What if the elegant theories in his father's journals were just the ramblings of a dreamer? He looked at the vast, open sections of the frame, at the stacks of fragile glass. The scale of it felt impossible. He was one boy against an entire winter. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. He sat inside his small cabin, the fire in the stone hearth crackling, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Boro lay at his feet, his head resting on Elias's boot. Elias had his father's journal open on his lap. He ran his fingers over a diagram illustrating airflow. A thick arrow showed cold air sinking along the outer glass wall, while a thinner arrow showed the warmer air trapped near the cabin rising, creating a slow, gentle convection current within the sun shell. It was supposed to work. Every calculation was precise, every angle considered. He closed the book and walked to the cabin door. He opened it, not to the biting wind of the outside world, but to the still, contained air of the unfinished shell. He could see the stars through the gaps in the roof. The air was cold, but it was a different kind of cold. It was still, deadened. The wind, which he could hear moaning high in the pines at the edge of the clearing, did not touch him here. It was already working. A small measure of peace settled over him. He closed the door, went back to the fire, and finished Mrs. Gable's pie. He would finish the roof tomorrow. The final pane of glass slid into place on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the official beginning of the end of light and warmth. Elias sealed it with the last of his putty, his fingers numb, his movement stiff with cold. He climbed down the ladder for the last time and stood beside Boro in the center of the clearing, looking at what he had built. It was strange and beautiful. A crystalline box, 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with his small, dark log cabin suspended inside it like a ship in a bottle. The low afternoon sun struck the angled southern roof, and the entire structure seemed to glow with a soft, internal light. It looked fragile, a thing of ice and air, an impossible dream made manifest against the grim, gray reality of the encroaching winter. From Jedediah's farm, he could see a figure on the porch, staring. From the road, a wagon had stopped, its driver pointing. He had done it. He walked to the single door he had built into the glass shell. He opened it and stepped inside. The air was immediately, noticeably different. The wind, a constant whining presence for the past month, was gone. The silence was profound. The temperature was still cold, but it lacked the vicious biting edge of the air outside. He walked the 10 feet to his cabin door and went inside, Boro at his heels. He stoked the fire, the familiar scent of wood smoke filling the small room. For the first time in 3 months, he felt a sense of completion. He had followed his father's plan. He had honored his memory with labor. Now all he could do was wait. The first test came a week later. A typical winter storm blew in from the north, dumping a foot of snow and sending temperatures plummeting to 10 below zero. In the valley, people hunkered down, stuffing rags into drafty window frames and feeding their fires constantly. The wind scoured the landscape. Inside the sun shell, the world was calm. The snow collected on the glass roof, a soft, insulating blanket. Elias had to clear it from the southern face with a long-handled broom to let the weak sunlight in, but the effort was minimal. He sat by his fire, reading, while the blizzard raged silently outside his glass walls. The temperature inside the shell, in the air gap between the glass and the cabin, hovered around 20 degrees, a full 30 degrees warmer than the outside world. It wasn't warm, but it was a profound, life-altering difference. His cabin, which usually required a constant roaring fire to keep the chill at bay, needed only half the wood. The heat it radiated was held by the shell, a thermal embrace. He walked to his woodpile. It was vast, dark, and perfectly, beautifully dry. Every piece was ready to burn, clean, and hot. Lena appeared 2 days after the storm passed, her cheeks red from the cold, a small sack in her hand. She stood for a moment outside the glass door, marveling at the way the structure shed the snow, the way the sunlight, though weak, seemed to be drawn into it. "My father said the wind would have torn it to pieces," she said as he let her in. She held out the sack. "Mother sent bread." "Thank her for me," Elias said. Lena walked around the interior of the shell, her boots crunching softly on the frozen earth. She placed a bare hand on the log wall of the cabin. "It's warm," she said, surprised. The logs had soaked up the heat from the fireplace inside and were now slowly releasing it into the buffer zone. "And the air, it doesn't hurt to breathe." She looked at him, her earlier respect deepening into something akin to awe. "It works. Your father's idea. It really works." "It works," Elias agreed, the simple words carrying the weight of months of toil and doubt. But the real test, the one that would be spoken of for generations, was yet to come. In mid-January, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. The air grew heavy and still. Boro became restless, whining and pacing the perimeter of the shell, his hackles raised at an unseen threat. Elias, checking his father's journals, found a passage describing the signs of a great storm, one his grandfather had weathered. "A silence that screams," his father had written. The storm that came was not a blizzard of snow, but a tempest of ice. It began as a cold, persistent rain, even though the temperature was 15 degrees below freezing. Supercooled water fell from the sky, freezing instantly on contact with any surface. The world was being encased in a tomb of clear, heavy ice. Within hours, every tree was coated in a glittering sheath a half-inch thick, then an inch, then 2. The elegant sweep of the pine branches grew heavy, then heavier, until they began to break with reports like rifle shots that echoed across the valley. The power lines that had only recently been run to the larger farms snapped under the impossible weight. The world went dark and silent, save for the relentless ticking of the freezing rain and the catastrophic cracking of the forest. From his window, Elias watched the devastation. Jedediah Croft's great woodpile, the symbol of his foresight, was now sealed under a solid 3-inch thick wall of ice. It was as useless as a pile of rocks. The roof of Sterling's largest barn groaned and then collapsed with a distant, muffled whoomp, its structure unable to bear the tonnage of the ice. Elias's glass house, however, behaved differently. The ice formed on the glass, yes, but the angled roof and the slight warmth bleeding from within the shell made the bond tenuous. Every so often, a great sheet of ice would lose its grip and slide off with a tremendous crash, shattering on the ground below. The structure groaned under the load, but the frame he had so painstakingly built held firm. The posts were deep, the beams were strong. His father's design had accounted for the weight of snow. It seemed it could also account for the weight of the world turning to ice. Inside, life continued. The light was dim, filtered through the translucent ice, but the cabin was warm. The fire burned steadily, fed by perfectly dry oak from the untouchable woodpile. Boro, his earlier anxiety eased by the security of their shelter, slept soundly by the hearth. The freezing rain fell for 2 days straight. On the third morning, the valley awoke to an apocalyptic landscape. It was a world of broken trees and crushed buildings, all locked in a glittering, impenetrable prison of ice. The roads were gone. communication was impossible, and the cold was absolute. For the families in their isolated farmhouses, with wet or inaccessible wood and no power, it was a death sentence. The first knock on the glass door came at midday. It was Jedediah Croft, his face a mask of gray exhaustion and defeat. His daughter Lena was with him, helping him stand. Jedediah's thick coat was stiff with ice. His beard was a frozen mass. Elias opened the door and let them into the buffer zone. The change in atmosphere was so immediate and profound that Jedediah stumbled, gasping in the still, calm air. He looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw the warm log cabin, the plume of smoke rising from its chimney. He saw the colossal, untouched woodpile, and he understood. "Our fire went out this morning," Jedediah said, his voice cracking. "The wood, it's all encased, can't even chip it out. My wife, she's so cold." Elias didn't hesitate. "Bring her here," he said. "Bring everyone." Lena looked at him, her eyes shining with tears of relief and something more. "Are you sure? There's not much room." "There's room," Elias said. It took the rest of the day. Elias and Jedediah, armed with axes to chip footholds in the ice, became a rescue party. They went from house to house, a journey of a few miles that took hours of brutal, dangerous work. They brought the Gables first, Martha so bundled in blankets she could barely walk, her husband's face stricken with fear. Then the Millers, with their 3 small children, the youngest blue with cold. By nightfall, 12 people were huddled inside Elias's small cabin. It was cramped and stuffy, but it was warm. It was alive. Boro moved among the children, letting them bury their cold hands in his thick fur, a calm and reassuring presence in the chaos. Elias kept the fire stoked, the heat radiating through the small space, a bastion against the frozen world outside. From the cabin window, they could see the other houses, dark and cold, their chimneys smokeless. They were the lucky ones. Silas Sterling and his family arrived the next morning. The proud man was humbled, his fine coat torn, his face pale. He did not bark orders. He stood before Elias, his wife and 2 daughters shivering behind him, and looked at the impossible structure that had saved them all. "Thorne," he said, his voice thick with emotion, I was wrong. I was a fool." He looked at the dry wood, the warm cabin, the faces of his neighbors safe inside. Is there room?" "There's always room," Elias said, and stepped aside to let them in. For 4 days, the 21 souls of the valley lived in Elias's cabin and the narrow space of the sun shell. Elias was their silent, tireless provider. He kept the fire blazing, rationed out the food he had stored, and gave his own bed to the Miller children, sleeping on the floor by the door with Boro. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant source of stability. He moved with a quiet purpose that calmed the frayed nerves of the others. They watched him, this strange, solitary boy they had dismissed as a madman, and saw a savior. Jedediah watched him most of all. He saw the way Elias checked the structure, the way he listened to the groans of the wood and glass, the way he cared for the fire. He saw not foolishness, but a deep, inherited wisdom. One evening, as they sat near the hearth, Jedediah spoke, his voice low so only Elias could hear. "Your father," he said, shaking his head slowly. "He always saw things differently, saw the patterns we were all too busy to notice. I called him a dreamer. I was wrong. He was an architect." He looked at Elias, his old eyes filled with a profound, painful respect. "And you, son, you're a builder." When the thaw finally came, it was as dramatic as the storm itself. The temperature rose 20 degrees in a single day. The great sheets of ice began to fall from the trees and roofs, and the valley was filled with the sound of a world shattering and reforming. The roads were a morass of broken branches and mud, but they were passable. Slowly, life began to return. The community that emerged from the sunshell was not the same one that had entered it. The rigid lines of property and pride had been melted by shared hardship and a common savior. They returned to their damaged homes not as isolated families, but as a unified group. The first thing they did, led by Jedediah and funded by a suddenly generous Silas Sterling, was to form work crews. They moved from farm to farm, repairing the damage, sharing what resources they had left. The center of this new community was Elias's glass house. It became a meeting place, a symbol of their survival. People no longer saw it as an eyesore or a folly. They saw it as a miracle. They came to Elias not with whispers and mockery, but with questions. Sterling, true to his word, brought him a ledger and a pen. "Write it down," he said. "Draw it out. Everything your father knew, everything you did. I'll pay for the materials. We're going to build more of them, one for every family in this valley." And so, Elias, who had always preferred the language of wood and stone, found himself teaching. He would sit with Jedediah and the other men, his father's journals spread out on the table, and explain the principles of thermal mass and passive solar gain. He was a quiet teacher, using few words, pointing to the drawings, letting his father's careful script do most of the talking. Lena was often there, helping him find the right words, her quick mind grasping the concepts and translating them for the others. The next autumn, the valley was filled with the sound of hammers and saws. 5 new sun shells were under construction, each one a copy of Elias's original, built around the existing farmhouses. Elias moved between the sites, a quiet supervisor, offering advice on setting the posts, on bracing the frame, on the proper angle for the roof. He was no longer the strange boy on the edge of town. He was the keeper of the knowledge that had saved them. He was the heart of the valley. Years passed. The glass houses became the defining feature of the region. Travelers would remark on the strange, glittering structures that allowed the valley's inhabitants to thrive in a climate that was harsh and unforgiving to others. The gardens inside the shells produced fresh greens well into December. The firewood was always dry. The children born after the great ice storm grew up thinking it was simply the way houses were built. Elias and Lena married in a quiet ceremony held inside the original sun shell. Their life was one of shared purpose and quiet contentment. Elias never lost his love for the simple act of building, and Lena's sharp intellect helped refine his father's designs, making each new structure more efficient than the last. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slower, his intelligent yellow eyes clouded with age. He spent his days sleeping in the patches of sunlight that moved across the cabin floor. One winter evening, with a blizzard raging harmlessly outside the glass walls, the old dog gave a contented sigh in his sleep and did not wake up. Elias and Lena buried him on the hill behind the house, beneath a tall pine tree that had survived the ice storm. Elias carved a simple stone marker, Boro. He was a good witness. Decades flowed by like a river. Elias grew into a man, then an old man, his hair turning the color of snow, his hands gnarled but still strong. He became the valley's elder, a living link to the storm that had reshaped their world. He was a man of few words to the end, but when he spoke, everyone listened. He taught their children how to read the sky, how to choose the right wood, how to build something that would last. He outlived Lena by 5 years, a quiet, lonely time spent tending their home and walking the hills with the memory of her and his old dog. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the same bed, in the same log cabin he had been born in, the cabin at the heart of the glass house. The entire valley turned out for his funeral. They buried him on the hill next to Lena and Boro. Silas Sterling's grandson, now a successful engineer, who had taken Elias's designs and spread them across the Northern Territories, commissioned a new grave marker. It was a single, large piece of granite, smooth and strong. On it, they carved the words, Elias Thorne. He had a plan. From the top of the hill, you could see the whole valley laid out below. The sun was setting, and the last of its light caught the angled roofs of the 24 glass houses scattered across the landscape. They glowed like embers, each one a beacon of warmth and safety against the coming night. And in the center of them all stood the original, the first sun shell, its glass panes weathered by 100 winters, its sturdy frame a testament to the quiet, stubborn boy who had dared to build a house around his house, and in doing so had built a future for them all. It stood against the wind and the cold, a monument not to foolishness, but to a radical and enduring faith in a better way to survive. It was his legacy, written in timber and glass against the sky. The work had been his argument, and the argument had been won.